At 120 now, 120 now, 30, 140, 50. In the first row at 150, 150. Mrs. Newman.
Britain has a long tradition of fine art auctioneering that has made London a centre for collectors and dealers from all over the world. And all over Britain, art galleries with important collections of landscape painting reflect the British artist's passion for his own countryside. The British scene has also inspired artists from other lands who found discerning patrons here to support them. Holbein and Van Dyck invited by kings. Canaletto, with this view of a sparkling Thames and sunlit city painted in 1750. Monet, who over 100 years later was captivated by the same river. Here the pale filtered light of fog-bound Victorian London transforms the solid Houses of Parliament into a spectral castle. Another modern artist, Oskar Kokoschka, shows the same city in a different light, a new pattern of shape and color. This bustling cosmopolitan city has been painted by many artists. Much of its past has been preserved on canvas. The past is also reflected in buildings and the traditions of craftsmanship and quality represented by famous names. These are all patterns of the past. Today's visitor to Britain can find patterns of the present in the changing colors of seasons and events. Although London has grown into a vast cosmopolitan city, it still retains the sense of openness and space characteristic of cities of a more leisurely age. London has its own countryside in the famous parks. By early February, carpets of crocuses, primroses and daffodils grow here in great profusion, bright splashes of spring color beneath the somber trees. The English garden has never been formal in the European sense, with grand promenades, avenues of trees, and geometrically proportioned flower beds. It is a haphazard concentration into a small area of the random beauty of the countryside, shown nowhere better than in the orchards and hop gardens of the county of Kent, to the southeast of London, and less than an hour's train or car ride away. Kent, the Garden of England. Ronald Hilder, born in the USA, has become one of England's best-known contemporary landscape artists, fascinated by the Kent countryside. Another characteristic of this part of England is its buildings. Buildings for work like these oast houses, where the hops used in brewing beer are dried. Indeed, all over Britain, working buildings of the past, windmills, watermills, maltings are carefully preserved in working order as a reminder of an older way of life, like Mount Nessing Windmill, again only 25 miles from the centre of London. Constructed of overlapping planking called weatherboarding, it is typical of the eastern part of England. Weatherboarding is also used in this old watermill, originally worked by the action of the sea at the head of a tidal creek. One is never far from the influence of the sea anywhere in Britain, but in East Anglia especially it is ever present. Fingers of water stretch far inland along this low-lying coast. The flatness endows it with characteristic wide open skies, constantly changing with moods of weather. The commonest landmarks are the towers of medieval churches, sentinels of the peace of the surrounding parish. The wool merchants of the Middle Ages built them, like miniature cathedrals to the greater glory of God and the hope of their own salvation. In this land of wide horizons on the borders of the counties of Essex and Suffolk, in 1776, perhaps the best loved and best known of all English landscape artists was born, John Constable. He was born here in the village of Dedham, whose church dominates the lower end of the Stour Valley. Beneath its tower, as a memorial to his most famous painting, stands a hay wain. Constable painted it as it stood in the river a few yards below the mill at Flatford, which was owned and worked by his father. Willie Lott's cottage, in the background of the hay wain, is the subject of several of his paintings. Today's visitor can see quite clearly the beauty of the effects of light which fascinated Constable 200 years ago. He found nearly all the subjects for his most famous paintings here within this small area. Constable probably painted the cornfield from this spot. The foreground trees have disappeared and the stream on the left is overgrown, but the gateway and distant church remain. The view across the Stour Valley is still much as Constable must have known it. A gentle landscape whose hedgerows and field patterns seem bathed in perpetual summer sunlight. The valley gave birth not only to Constable, but also to Thomas Gainsborough, who grew up in the market town of Sudbury, less than 20 miles to the west. Methods of farming have progressed over 200 years, and the small intimate fields of Constable have grown to much vaster proportions, harvested mechanically and not by hand as in Constable's day. This harvest scene in Herefordshire on the borders of Wales was painted by George Lewis. Another English artist fascinated by the midsummer light of the English harvest field was Richard Burchett. His view of the distant Isle of Wight reinforces the continual presence of the sea in many English paintings. The white chalk cliffs which stretch along half the length of England's south coast include the famous Seven Sisters between Seaford and Newhaven in Sussex. Britain's wide panoramic views allow artists to exploit tone colours of land and sky. Looking towards the spire of Chichester Cathedral, we can see that perfect marriage between natural contours and man-made objects which is so characteristic of English landscape painting. And Britain's varied building materials reflect the different textures of the land itself: granite, limestone, or flints, for example, when split in half and set into plaster, form the decorative facade of many churches and public buildings to be seen all over Britain. This checkerboard effect, a traditional pattern, is achieved by combining squares of stone and flint inside a stone framework. Fine examples of this flint work are the great 15th century gateway to St. Osyth Priory in Essex and the Guildhall in the marketplace at Norwich. Texture and colour, flowers, fruit and vegetables in kaleidoscopic profusion on the small bright stalls of the market. Street markets exist in most towns and cities in the British Isles, an essential part of the texture, the feel of British life. John Crome was a well-known artist and a member, together with the Cotmans and others, of the so-called Norwich School. The marketplace he painted still exists, and the bustling stalls covered in wide bolts of multicolored canvas have recently been restored. Norwich Cathedral has one of the most imposing spires in Europe. The stone carving is just one example of the widely differing variety of textures of English architecture and countryside. Strange shops, too, can be found in the quiet older streets. Where else could you find, opposite a fish tackle shop and next to a basket weaver's, a shop entirely devoted to mustard? Shop signs are universal, but many reflect an especially English character. This painted sign introduces a unique shopping centre on Britain's south coast. Brighton is a famous seaside resort, and the lanes are particularly interesting to the visitor, containing a wide variety of small shops, many specialising in antique furniture and silver. Brighton, like many of Britain's south coast resorts, attracts a large number of young people to its summer language schools. Brighton became known as a pleasure resort during the reign of George III, and his son, the Prince Regent, built this amazing seaside palace, the Royal Pavilion, a mixture of Indian exterior and Chinese-influenced interior. John Nash's original drawings reflect the sophistication of the age. Around the pavilion, an elegant town grew up with terraces and fine squares of houses. During this famous Regency period, two of Britain's greatest artists, Constable and Turner, stayed in Brighton and found subjects which have become very famous paintings. This is Constable's view of Brighton Beach about 1827. Then it still had a fleet of small fishing boats, although the fishing industry was already in decline in the face of Brighton's growing popularity as a holiday resort. Today the little boats have returned in force to Brighton's marina, the most modern in Europe. But Pebble Beach and facade of the promenade have changed little. That unique British institution, the Seaside Pier, formed the subject of one of J.M.W. Turner's best-known paintings. The fascinating play of light on water intrigued Turner, and he was drawn to paint it again and again in an astonishing number of different pictures. Turner painted the sun setting behind the old chain pier. But for today's visitor or painter, the same stillness and play of light gives the Palace Pier a timeless quality. Folded away in the heart of England, there are many unexpected treasures, quiet places to reward the diligent searcher. A bird's-eye view can literally be yours from the top of Sutton Bank, looking southwestwards across North Yorkshire towards Kirkstall Abbey, painted about 1790 by Thomas Girtin, one of England's supreme watercolourists. Fountains Abbey, like Kirkstall, is a beautifully preserved example of great monastic building. The narrow valley which encloses the Abbey precincts gives the impression of a peaceful, harmonious and secluded way of life, in direct contrast to the majestically ostentatious remains of Whitby Abbey. Here on a huge headland jutting out into the North Sea and overlooking the quaint old fishing port in its harbours, the Abbey still attracts the artist of today. As far west in Wales as one can go is the city of St. David's in Pembrokeshire. No bigger than a large village, it contains the splendid ruins of a monastery and a beautiful cathedral. The wide panoramic views afforded by cliff-top walks in the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park are as impressive to the present-day visitor as they were to the romantic painters of the 19th century. Victorian artists romanticized British history, using castles and ruins as centerpieces of elemental struggles. Great castles are to be seen all over the British Isles. In Wales particularly, they remind us of the Norman conquerors. Amid the rugged grandeur of the Scottish Highlands, steeped in a fighting tradition, the Celtic spirit survives, and nowhere more so than in the Highland Games. Here at Ballater on Deeside, only a few miles from the royal castle of Balmoral, sporting, dance and piping competitions are enjoyed by locals and Scottish exiles alike.
By the rules! 1, 2! That's what I...
The Highland Games have always had a strong military flavour, and they still retain that unique sense of warlike competition, as expressed in this traditional tug-of-war between opposing teams. Turner's great love of the sea brought him to paint humble fishing boats. On the estuary of the River Blackwater, lovely old cutter-rigged yachts and working boats gently gather for an annual race. Turner also painted the huge pleasure yachts of his day, like the Marquis of Angus's Pearl seen here in his yachting at Cowes. Today, Turner's scene is brought exactly to life, a moving canvas for the modern visitor. Amongst the most picturesque and frequently painted scenes of Victorian England were fleets of fishing boats entering or leaving harbour. The seacoast, with its changing light, reflections, moods of weather, has always provided a fascinating holiday place for Englishmen living in inland industrial cities. Townscapes like this are typical of the modern artist L.S. Lowry. Like Constable, a painter whose childhood environment made him a painter. Nowhere in Britain is the contrast between modern cities and exquisite countryside greater than here in the world-famous Lake District in the northwest of England. Turner painted this dramatic picture of Buttermere in Cumbria. But English seaside towns like Scarborough in Yorkshire are historical as well as pleasure centres. Here too the castle dominates the old town and fishing harbour, And today, the great variety of coastal scenery attracts visitors from all over the world, especially those with children. Visits to island bird sanctuaries please both the ornithologist and the amateur photographer, as well as the artist. Britain has many wildlife sanctuaries. One here on the Farne Islands off the Northumbrian coast is in the shadow of the great castle of nearby Bamborough. Two of Britain's most famous aspects are its castles and the village green. And what more typical than the ritual summer pastime of cricket? For visitors and Englishmen alike, it characterizes the British way of life. Perhaps this late 18th century view of a village cricket match was painted by a passing balloonist. Bowls, too, is another, even more sedate English summer game. But for sheer excitement, colour and atmosphere, nothing can beat horse racing at glorious Goodwood. This painting, dating from the year 1886, shows a collection of rich and famous people, from the then Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, to the composers Gilbert and Sullivan and the famous African explorer Stanley. One can still picnic on the lawn in front of that same grandstand and watch your winner pay for the champagne. The men in the white gloves aren't orchestral conductors, they're just another part of the traditional English scene. Bookmakers' tic-tac men, relaying the wagers on the race. Horses have always fascinated Englishmen, and English painters, from George Stubbs, discovered and patronized early in his life by the Duke of Richmond, to the contemporary Munnings, whose equestrian paintings are famous all over the world. The humble New Forest pony, still wild in this area of Hampshire, is another example of the varied wildlife to be seen in the British Isles. The landscape artist continually returns to the beauties of the countryside in his search for new subjects and inspiration. But the ordinary visitor can find pursuits that will enable him to enjoy those same beauties in a direct and personal way, perhaps by horse riding or pony trekking. Fishing is another way of getting the real feel of Britain's countryside. It has inspired subjects for sporting prints, whether 3 men in a boat coarse fishing in a river or salmon fishing in Wales. And what better way to view the marvellous countryside of the North Yorkshire Moors National Park than by steam train? That great British invention of the 19th century, which so changed the face of Britain's landscape and the world's. It was the steam train that took over from the vast network served by mail coach. At one time, in Dickensian London, when Queen Victoria had just ascended the throne, one stagecoach a minute left the city for every imaginable part of the kingdom. Hardly surprising, then, that this too should have given rise to a whole range of mail coach paintings and engravings. John Herring painted the London to Glasgow Express. He was, with Landseer, perhaps the best-known equestrian artist of the last century, and his Horse Fair shows the Englishman's love of horses at its best, set amidst the rolling countryside of the home counties. Herring painted himself into this picture, looking more like a prosperous farmer than a greatly respected member of the art world. The horse was also an integral part of the sporting scene, with Stubbs as its most famous painter. Paintings of hunting scenes in Britain have been popular ever since the early 18th century. The bright coats of the huntsman contrast dramatically with the somber tones of the English winter landscape. Ever popular with Englishmen and visitors alike, these pictures find ready buyers on the London art market, bringing us again to the art centre of the world from which we started this journey across the enormously varied pattern of Britain's landscape.
Lot 132, as illustrated. 800 here, at 800, 850, 950, at 950, 1,050, 1,150, 1,250, 1,300, 1,400, 1,500, 1,600, 1,700, at 1,700. Have you done at 1,700? Thomas Weaver, Brown Hunter in the landscape. 200 here, at 200, 220, 240, 260, 280, 300, 320, 350, for a lady at 350, at 350, all done, 350.